Hello my friends, and welcome to the channel for another Escape from Tarkov video. In this one, I want to take a look at another 5 weapon builds that you can get up and running for about 100,000 rubles or less. I've really enjoyed setting a budget like this and seeing what kind of weapons I can build within that price range. It's a fun way to limit test weapons in the game and see what can be done without too much investment. I think it also gives players a nice starting point to build off of with their own additions and upgrades, whether those be purchased or found in raid and added on the fly. With the new recoil system, a lot of these budget setups are actually way more viable than you might think, and they can be really useful for doing money farming runs and scav kill quests. For this video, I've got 3 rifles and 2 SMGs to cover, and in addition to showing my basic budget setups, I'll also recommend a few upgrades on each weapon for players that want to spend a bit of extra cash to juice up their builds. To start this one off, I want to take a look at my go-to budget ADAR build, which replaces the basic wooden furniture to boost ergonomics and add on a flashlight. The ADAR is one of my favorite weapons for the early game, and specifically for doing scav kill quests, since the semi-auto fire rate ensures you're not wasting ammo. It's cheap so it doesn't burn through your money, and it has a lot of potential upgrades that are pretty easy to acquire. For about 30 to 40,000 rubles on the market, plus about 60,000 in parts, this build ends up at almost exactly 100k rubles when it's all put together. The first changes I make to my ADAR is to swap out the wooden parts. For the handguard, I go for the black MOE SL handguard from Skier, which gives a big boost to ergonomics and lets you add attachments using M-lock rails. For the grip, I like using the Daniel Defense Enhanced M-Lock foregrip on this setup, which has a nice boost to ergo and recoil for a pretty reasonable price. I also usually take out the Balder Pro flashlight as a budget tactical device. Next, I add on the Chris DS150 stock and then the basic Colt A2 pistol grip to replace the wooden rear stock. For the muzzle device, I swap out the default ADAR muzzle for the KAC QDC 556 compensator, which gives a small recoil buff, but more importantly allows you to attach an NT4 suppressor if you find it or buy one on the market. I also swap out the front sight for the Wyndham Weaponry railed gas block or the MK12 gas block after unlocking them through Gunsmith. For a sight on this build, I'm just running the Cobra reflex sight with a sight shade for a cheap optic that boosts ergonomics a bit. For recommended upgrades on the ADAR, the most obvious one is to add the NT4 suppressor, which is about 30,000 rubles on the market. It bumps up the price of the build a bit, but it's well worth the cost in my opinion. The ADAR also works quite well with magnified scopes, so if you can find or buy an LCAN or a 2x prism scope, those are quite nice upgrades. Next up, I want to take a look at another 556 build, this time with the Scar L, which can give you full auto 556 for a pretty reasonable price, with recoil that's stable enough to keep controlled bursts on target. You can get the Scar for about 50,000 rubles on the market, and there's 2 different color variations, so make sure to check the price on both types to get the best deal. Also keep in mind that there's a couple different barrel lengths for the Scar. The long and the medium barrel are both pretty good, but the shortest barrel does kind of struggle with recoil compared to the other 2. For about 50,000 rubles on the market, and with a total parts cost of about 45,000, you can get a pretty simple Scar build up and running for just about exactly 100,000 rubles. To start this off, I swap out the default muzzle device for the KAC QDC 556 compensator for a small recoil buff and the ability to attach a suppressor if you want. Next, I add on the BCM Gunfighter grip for a nice ergonomics boost and some recoil reduction, and a cheap Balder Pro flashlight for the utility. For an optic, I kind of like the SRS reflex sight as a decent optic at around 20,000 rubles, but you can swap this for whatever you prefer. The big upgrade that I would recommend on this if you want to spend a bit more money would again be the NT4 suppressor, which really helps with recoil and muzzle flash, but it does add about 30k to the build cost. You can also make good work of magnified scopes on the Scar, so something like an LCAN Spectre scope is a great upgrade as well. Other smaller upgrades would be to add a new pistol grip and some backup iron sights for extra ergonomics. Next up for this video, let's take a look at the MPX, and specifically the integrally suppressed version of the MPX that Peacekeeper sells after you've finished his Eagle Eye quest where you need to find the UAVs on Shoreline. The MPX is a phenomenal SMG, especially with the integrated suppressor, as it really brings down the recoil to almost non-existent levels. Because of this, you really don't have to do much modding at all to make it better. With easy access to PST and even AP 6.3 ammo at reasonable costs, the MPX is one of my favorite SMGs in Tarkov, and I love running it as a lightweight weapon for looting runs. You can buy this MPX for $440 or about 60,000 rubles. And with a total parts cost of about 32,000, the build costs around 95 to 100,000 rubles total when it's all put together. For my build, I just add the BCM gunfighter grip and a Balder Pro flashlight onto the handguard rails for a nice ergonomics boost and some utility from the flashlight. Then I just put a Delta Point reflex sight onto the top rail, and that's basically it for this build. There's a ton of other mods that you can add to the MPX, but honestly you don't really need to. This setup already has good ergonomics and awesome recoil the way that it is. The only upgrade that I would truly recommend is to use the 41 round MPX magazines from mechanic level 3 if you have them unlocked, as they're probably the best 9mm SMG mags in the game. The other SMG that I want to recommend for a budget build in this video is, perhaps surprisingly to some, the 45 caliber Vector, which has risen way up to the top of my list of favorite SMGs in this patch after the recoil rework. I seriously love using this little pocket rocket, whether it's on a budget build or fully kitted out with a suppressor and AP ammo. The sheer amount of lead that it can send flying in a split second is just hard to compete with, and it's one of my all-time favorite weapons for running factory for the quests on that map. With a flea market price of about 60,000 rubles and a total parts cost of about 38,000 rubles, a budget Vector setup costs almost exactly 100,000 rubles to build, and it can punch well above its weight class, even with just 45 FMJ ammo. The clutch tip that really makes it work as a budget build is that you can get the 30 round Vector mags for one pack of Strike cigarettes from Skier level 2, which are often 4,000 rubles or less on the market, so it's a very cheap, easy way to get these magazines pretty early on in the wipe. First up for this build, for my budget setup, I add on the Vector 45 ACP flash hider, which gives a pretty nice recoil reduction for only like 5,000 rubles. Next, I add on the BCM gunfighter grip and a Balder Pro flashlight, and then for my sight, I really like the Delta Point reflex sight on close range guns like the Vector. Other than this, there isn't really much that you can add onto the Vector. For a recommended upgrade, obviously getting the suppressor is a pretty good choice, and it's often on the market for only about 25,000 rubles. That being said, this thing is just as much fun to use loud and proud, especially on factory where silence doesn't really matter that much. For the last build in this video, I want to quickly take a look at the RPK-16 as a really underrated way to get a nice 545 build setup without much modding and at a pretty damn reasonable price. The RPK is very similar to the SCAR in that it doesn't have a lot of interchangeable parts to upgrade, so you can just pick one up and put a few parts onto it and then you're pretty much good to go. With a pretty stable flea market price of 40,000 rubles or less and a parts cost of about 60,000 for this build, it's almost exactly 100,000 rubles for a pretty solid budget build on the RPK. First up for this build, I swap out the default muzzle device for the PWS CQB 545 compensator, which knocks off a pretty good chunk of recoil for a decent price. And this thing has a pretty stable flea market price as well, so you can get it even if you don't have Skier level 3 unlocked. Next, I add the BCM gunfighter grip and a Balder Pro flashlight onto the handguard for some simple, cheap upgrades. For another great ergonomics boost at a low cost, I like to add on the Tapco saw style pistol grip as well. Finally, for the optic, I've been using the SRS reflex sight on this setup, but as usual, you can easily swap this out for whatever you prefer. For recommended upgrades on the RPK, first off, I would say that if you find the Hexagon AK-74 suppressor for a good price on the market, it's a great replacement for the PWS compensator. You can also swap out the default stock for the Chris DS150 stock as well for a bit of extra stats and ergo and recoil. And with that, we've covered another 5 weapon builds that you can set up for around 100,000 rubles or less, which I think is quite the reasonable price for a weapon build in Tarkov. What do you think of my selections? Is there any budget setup that you think I'm missing out on? Let me know down in the comments. Thanks for checking out the video. I've got a link to my Twitch channel in the description if you want to come check out some of my Tarkov gameplay live. And until next time, stay safe in Tarkov City.